The petty offenders were huddled near the main door, relaxed, eyeing the pub across the road and nipping across for a sly half-pint if time allowed it. They'd be smoking and spitting and wearing tracksuits and not giving a shit if you excused yourself and said you needed to get past. Grey skin, eyes in pits. They're the regulars, the folk who break into your shed when you're on holiday, the ones who get lifted for throwing abuse and bottles at paramedics. But he hadn't been prepared for the silence on the inside. Court, in general, was a muted tragedy. Whole worlds were changing, and not a word could be said, not a voice raised. Andy had witnessed wee grannies mouth off at librarians when their reserved book wasn't available, and tourists lose the head with airline staff when their carry-on bag was deemed too big for the overhead locker. Folk regularly shouted at delivery drivers, receptionists, customers who pushed in ahead of them in a queue. And the worst part? Usually the person in a rage would have lost very little, if anything. Maybe some time, maybe a few quid, but nothing that couldn't be fixed, repaired, replaced, earned again, forgotten about by tea time. They were all things that left no scars. Yet here, now, in the courtroom, everyone managed to maintain and respect a call for silence, despite the fact someone who was loved had died, and someone else had made that happen. It was like being underwater, watching a film on mute. Voices would come, but only when their name was called, then ticked off a list, and only when they were answering questions put to them by someone else. It was absurd, insulting. How could Andy's grief possibly be contained? Shouting was honest. Hating was honest. But these were things that could not be measured and labelled and put in a file, and they were not welcome in this room. Little by little, he'd learned it was a place for silence, or for words that were carefully chosen and euphemised. Rough stones, rubbed by lawyers and journalists until they were transformed into smooth, round pebbles that fitted neatly in your palm and no longer scratched. He dropped his head and stared again at his own hands. Was glad they couldn't talk. Journalists could, though, and did, too loudly. As if on cue, he heard swirling whispers from the press bench as the last few reporters squeezed into place, thigh to thigh, elbow to elbow. There must have been a dozen of them, hunched over notepads, clicking pens, flicking pages, knowing today was one of those days they'd give readers what they wanted. A verdict. The judge strode up to the bench, tugging his black gown onto his shoulder. He glanced at the public gallery, then sat down and signalled for the lawyers to do their bit. Turn actions into words. Blame into a decision. An ordinary human into a killer. Chapter 2. 6 months earlier. Betty didn't discriminate. It didn't matter what age they were, or where they'd travelled before she encountered them. She enjoyed inventing their histories, creating vivid images in her mind of the many fingers that had touched the lucky pennies before she had. When she wasn't cleaning other people's dirty houses, she spent her time among those imagined lives, giving names and shapes and purposes to people she'd never meet, but with whom she felt a palpable connection. Here she was, Betty Stevenson, in Portobello, linked by the glorious frivolities of life to bearded businessmen in Perth and tubby little boys in Nethy Bridge, and an eccentric granny in Kirkcudbright, and maybe the ginger woman who worked in the butcher's just down the road and who had a terrible stutter and took 20 seconds to say the word mince. Here she was, holding a moment of all those other lives in the palm of her hand, closing her fingers around history. Human tattoos pressed into copper. But the joy wasn't in the keeping. Betty bent down next to a street lamp on Portobello Promenade, pretended she was retying the lace of her shoe. Then, quietly, she placed the 1 pence